In a small courtroom in Westbridge, two officers sat at the prosecution's table, confident in their victory. They had done this before, twisted the truth, buried evidence, walked away untouched. But this time they picked the wrong target. The woman they mocked, the woman they thought they had crushed under the weight of their power, was not just any defendant. She was Elise Morgan. And what they didn't know, she was the director of Homeland Security. What started as a simple trial soon unraveled into a storm of corruption, conspiracy, and betrayal. As the truth came to light, it became clear Westbridge was just the beginning. There were bigger players, men in the shadows who didn't just protect the corrupt, but profited from them. Elise was never supposed to make it this far. But now, she's coming for them all. Will she expose the system before it silences her? Or has she just stepped into a war she can't win? Stay tuned to find out. And before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Hit subscribe so you never miss a story like this again. Now let's dive in. Chapter 1 begins now. The Marston County Courthouse stood tall against the gray morning sky, its stone walls weathered by decades of legal battles. The air outside was thick with anticipation as reporters, legal analysts, and concerned citizens gathered near the entrance. Inside, the grand courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers. Spectators filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the defendant's table, where a poised black woman sat with an air of quiet confidence. Elise Morgan, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, folded her hands on the polished wooden table. Her expression was unreadable, her dark eyes scanning the room with quiet calculation. Despite the smirks from the prosecution's side, despite the murmurs of doubt from the jury, she remained still, composed. She had seen this before. She had faced worse. Across the aisle, officers Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson sat at the prosecution's table, their polished badges gleaming under the overhead lights. Ridley, a burly man in his 50s with graying temples, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest. Beside him, Thompson, younger and sharper, adjusted his tie with a cocky smirk. "I bet she tries the victim angle," Thompson whispered, nudging Ridley. Ridley chuckled under his breath. "They always do." The judge's gavel struck the wooden desk, silencing the room. Court is now in session. A tall woman in a crisp black robe, Judge Pamela Whitfield, surveyed the room over her reading glasses. Her gaze lingered on Elise for a fraction longer than necessary before turning to the prosecution. "Ms. Marshall, you may proceed." Colleen Marshall, the assistant district attorney, rose with the confidence of a woman who believed she had already won. Her blonde hair was pinned into a tight bun, and her tailored gray suit was impeccable. She approached the jury with measured steps, her voice smooth as silk. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone laced with practiced authority. "We are gathered here today to determine whether the defendant, Elise Morgan, unlawfully obstructed a police investigation and endangered the safety of two dedicated officers." She turned to glance at Elise before continuing. "The prosecution will present evidence proving that Ms. Morgan deliberately interfered with an ongoing police operation, ignored lawful orders, and created a scene that escalated into hostility." Officers Ridley and Thompson, both decorated members of the force, were simply doing their jobs. But instead of cooperating, Ms. Morgan chose to obstruct them. At the word obstruct, Ridley and Thompson exchanged knowing smirks. Elise's lawyer, Gregory Holtz, remained silent beside her, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. He was an older man, well past his prime, but still razor-sharp where it mattered. His steel-gray hair and deep-set eyes gave him the look of a man who had seen too much, fought too many battles. Marshall continued, her voice taking on a more dramatic tone. "And the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, will speak for itself." With a self-assured nod, she returned to her seat. Judge Whitfield turned her gaze to Holtz. "Mr. Holtz, your opening statement." Gregory stood, adjusting his dark blue tie before stepping toward the jury. His voice, though softer than Marshall's, carried a weight that demanded attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today you will hear a story, one that has been carefully constructed to paint my client as an aggressor, a troublemaker, a woman who disrespected law enforcement. He paused, glancing at Elise. But today I ask you not just to listen to their story. I ask you to watch. I ask you to observe the details that don't quite fit. The missing pieces. The contradictions. Gregory turned to face the officers, his gaze lingering just long enough to unsettle them. You will see footage of what really happened that day. You will hear testimony from eyewitnesses who saw what the officers did before my client was arrested. And, most importantly, his voice dropped lower, drawing the jury in. You will learn exactly who Elise Morgan is. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ridley's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, whispering something to Thompson. Marshall, however, was less amused. She straightened in her seat, her hands tightening around her pen. Elise allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The first move had been made. The judge nodded. The prosecution may call its first witness. Officer Ridley rose, buttoning his uniform jacket before walking to the witness stand. He took his seat, his wide shoulders squared, his chin lifted slightly. Marshall approached with a reassuring nod. Officer Ridley, could you describe the events that led to Ms. Morgan's arrest? Ridley exhaled dramatically, shaking his head as if recalling an unpleasant memory. We were responding to a call about suspicious activity in a neighborhood with a known history of crime. When we arrived, we found Ms. Morgan standing outside a residence. She appeared agitated, questioning our presence. Elise sat motionless, her expression impassive. She refused to follow our instructions. Ridley continued. She was aggressive, raising her voice, demanding to know why we were there. We warned her multiple times, but she wouldn't listen. Marshall nodded. And did she physically obstruct your investigation? Ridley's lips curled in amusement. She stepped between us and the property, trying to prevent us from proceeding. She even placed a hand on my arm at one point, which... That's a lie. A voice muttered from the gallery. A hush fell over the courtroom as heads turned. The judge banged her gavel. Order! Elise glanced toward the back of the room, where a woman in a dark coat stood with her arms crossed. She met Elise's gaze briefly before sitting down. Ridley cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his seat. As I was saying, he continued, his confidence dimmed slightly. Ms. Morgan was actively trying to interfere. We had no choice but to detain her. Marshall nodded approvingly. No further questions. The judge turned to Holtz. Mr. Holtz, your witness. Gregory rose, adjusting his glasses as he approached. He took a slow step forward, letting the silence stretch. Officer Ridley, he said at last, are you certain that Ms. Morgan physically interfered? Absolutely. Gregory hummed. And you're also certain that your body cameras captured everything? Ridley's fingers twitched slightly. Well, unfortunately, our body cams malfunctioned that day. A few quiet murmurs spread across the room. Gregory tilted his head. Malfunctioned? Both of them. Ridley nodded stiffly. It happens. Holtz exhaled, shaking his head in mock disbelief. That's quite the coincidence. He turned toward the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we are expected to believe that not one, but two police body cameras failed at the exact same moment. He stepped back toward the defense table, picking up a USB drive. Fortunately, we don't have to rely on the officer's recollection alone. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense would like to submit a new piece of evidence. Marshall's head snapped up. Objection, Your Honor. The defense has not previously disclosed this. Judge Whitfield held up a hand. I'll allow it. Play the footage. Holtz inserted the drive into the courtroom's media system. The screen flickered, then came to life. The grainy footage played, showing Ridley and Thompson approaching Elise. Their faces were clearly visible. The camera's audio was muffled but audible enough. People like you should learn when to back off. Ridley's voice echoed through the speakers. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Ridley's smirk vanished. Thompson stiffened in his seat. Holtz folded his arms. Shall we continue? The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. On the screen, the grainy footage continued to play, revealing Officer Ridley's smug expression as he loomed over Elise. His words rang out again, crystal clear in the hush of the room. People like you should learn when to back off. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitfield's stern gaze flicked toward the prosecution, her lips pressing into a thin line. Marshall quickly stood, her voice clipped. Your Honor, this footage is incomplete. It lacks context. Gregory Holtz, however, remained poised. Context? What more context do we need, Ms. Marshall? The prosecution has painted my client as an aggressor, yet here we have evidence that Officer Ridley himself engaged in intimidation. Ridley shifted in his seat. Thompson clenched his jaw, his fingers gripping the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Judge Whitfield sighed, adjusting her glasses. Mr. Holtz, do you have additional footage? Gregory nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The defense intends to present a second video captured from a different angle, one that will further clarify what happened that day. He retrieved another USB drive from his briefcase, moving toward the media system. The prosecution remained silent this time. They knew objecting would only make them appear desperate. The screen flickered again, displaying a new video. This one was clearer, taken from across the street. The angle perfectly captured Elise, standing with her hands raised in a non-threatening gesture as Officers Ridley and Thompson flanked her. I have the right to know why you're questioning me, her voice rang out. Ridley laughed in response. You people always have something to say. Just step aside and let us do our job. The jury watched, their expressions shifting from skepticism to unease. In the gallery, murmurs of discontent grew louder. Then, in the video, Thompson suddenly grabbed Elise's wrist, yanking her toward him. The movement was aggressive, unprovoked. Elise stumbled but remained composed. Do not touch me, she said firmly. Ridley stepped closer, his voice lowering. What are you going to do about it? Then, the officers shoved her against the police cruiser. The screen froze. Gregory turned to the jury. Now tell me, does this look like a woman who was resisting? Marshall shot up. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is using dramatic interpretation rather than presenting legal arguments. Judge Whitfield exhaled slowly before responding. Objection overruled. The jury may draw its own conclusions. Marshall's lips thinned as she sat down, her fingers tapping nervously against the table. Gregory faced Ridley, his expression calm but firm. Officer Ridley, would you like to explain to the court why your testimony contradicts this footage? Ridley's face reddened. Look, videos don't capture everything. She was hostile. Maybe it doesn't look that way, but we could feel the aggression. Holtz let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. So now we're talking about feelings instead of facts. Laughter spread through the gallery before the judge's gavel brought silence again. Ridley clenched his jaw. We had reason to believe she was obstructing an investigation. Gregory raised an eyebrow. Did you, though? He gestured to the screen. Because what I see is an officer initiating unnecessary force against a woman who simply asked a question. A woman who... He turned toward the jury, his voice steady. You have yet to truly know. A shift in energy swept through the room. The weight of those words hung in the air. Elise sat still, watching as the prosecution's carefully crafted narrative began to crumble. She had expected resistance. She had expected them to fight tooth and nail to maintain control. But she knew something they didn't. They were already losing. Judge Whitfield sighed, rubbing her temples. Officer Ridley, you may step down. Ridley shot a glance at Thompson before walking stiffly back to his seat. The court will take a 10-minute recess, the judge announced, banging her gavel. The moment the judge exited, the courtroom burst into hushed whispers. Reporters furiously scribbled notes. The murmurs from the gallery grew louder. Marshall leaned in toward Ridley and Thompson, her voice a low hiss. You assured me this case was airtight. That video, she exhaled sharply. That was not airtight. Ridley's fists clenched. It's just one video. Thompson, however, wasn't as confident. He wiped his palms against his pants, swallowing hard. She set us up, he muttered. She knew this was coming. Ridley scoffed. How? There's no way she could have predicted. But he stopped mid-sentence as realization dawned. His eyes darted to Elise, who sat calmly, watching them from across the room. Gregory Holtz, catching Ridley's expression, leaned toward Elise. I think it's sinking in. Elisa's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Not yet," she murmured. "But it will." The hallway was alive with hushed conversations. A group of journalists huddled near the doors, discussing the footage, their cameras still rolling. At the far end of the corridor, a woman stood alone, her arms crossed. She had been in the gallery during the trial, but no one seemed to know who she was. Elise noticed her. Their eyes met. The woman nodded once before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Gregory caught the exchange. "Someone you know?" Elise took a slow breath before answering. "Someone who's been waiting for this as long as I have." Before Gregory could press further, a bailiff approached them. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Holtz, court is resuming." Elise stood, smoothing her suit. "Let's finish what we started." The judge returned to her seat, glancing between the defense and prosecution. "Mr. Holtz, does the defense have another witness?" Gregory nodded. "We do, Your Honor." He turned toward the gallery. "The defense calls Sergeant Miguel Trevino to the stand." Ridley stiffened. Thompson's face drained of color. The courtroom doors opened, and a uniformed officer entered, a man in his late 40s with a stern, weathered face. He walked with purpose, his expression unreadable. Marshall's eyes flashed with alarm. "Your Honor, I object. Sergeant Trevino was not on the witness list provided by the defense." Gregory smiled faintly. "That's because he just came forward." The judge gave Trevino a long look before sighing. "Objection overruled. Sergeant Trevino, please take the stand." Trevino sat down, raising his right hand as he was sworn in. Gregory stepped forward. "Sergeant Trevino, can you tell the court what you witnessed on the day of Miss Morgan's arrest?" Trevino's gaze flicked toward Ridley and Thompson before settling on Gregory. "I arrived after the call for backup," he said, his voice calm but firm. "When I got there, Miss Morgan was already in cuffs." "And what did you notice?" Trevino hesitated, then exhaled. "I noticed that both Officer Ridley and Officer Thompson's body cameras were off. When I asked them about it, they brushed it off, saying they weren't working." The jury whispered among themselves. Gregory nodded. "And in your experience, Sergeant, how often do multiple body cameras fail at the exact same time?" Trevino's jaw tightened. "Almost never." Marshall shot to her feet. "Objection. Speculative." The judge nodded. "Sustained." Gregory didn't flinch. "Sergeant, have you ever filed complaints about these officers before?" A long silence stretched between them. Then Trevino nodded. "Yes, multiple times." The courtroom exploded in murmurs once more. Gregory smiled. The foundation was cracking. But Elise? She knew they were only just getting started. A hush fell over the courtroom. The weight of Sergeant Trevino's words settled over the room like a thick fog, suffocating, inescapable. "Yes, multiple times." Judge Whitfield leaned forward, studying Trevino intently. "Sergeant, are you saying you have previously filed complaints against Officers Ridley and Thompson?" Trevino adjusted his posture, his jaw tightening before he nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Gregory Holtz didn't move, didn't speak right away. He let the revelation linger, let it simmer in the minds of the jury, let it echo in the silence that followed. Then, finally, he took a step forward. "Sergeant Trevino, can you specify what these complaints entailed?" Trevino exhaled slowly, as if weighing the consequences of his words. "Excessive force, mishandling of suspects, harassment." His eyes flicked toward the officers, and for the first time, a shadow of guilt crossed his face. "None of my reports ever went anywhere. They were buried." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. Ridley sat rigid in his chair, his face stone. Thompson, on the other hand, shifted uncomfortably, his knee bouncing beneath the table. Marshall stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the case at hand." Judge Whitfield didn't look convinced. "I disagree, Ms. Marshall. If these complaints establish a pattern of behavior, then it is relevant to the jury's assessment of the officer's credibility." Marshall's lips thinned. Gregory turned back to Trevino. "Sergeant, were you aware of Miss Morgan's background at the time of her arrest?" Trevino shook his head. "No, I didn't know who she was." Gregory nodded. "And if you had?" Trevino hesitated before responding. I would have questioned everything I was told about her. Silence. Gregory turned toward the jury, his voice calm, steady. Sergeant Trevino, a man who has served on the force for years, was ignored when he tried to report the very same behavior that led to my client's arrest. He paused. So the question is, how many others have been ignored? How many others have been mistreated without the benefit of a courtroom like this? Marshall shot up again. Objection. Judge Whitfield waved a hand. The jury will decide the importance of this information. Marshall's jaw clenched as she sat back down, her fingers white-knuckled against the table. Gregory turned back to Trevino. No further questions, Your Honor. Prosecution, the judge asked. Marshall hesitated before standing. She approached Trevino slowly, her voice measured. Sergeant, are you claiming that every complaint you filed against Officers Ridley and Thompson was dismissed? Trevino's face remained unreadable. Yes. Could it be because there was no evidence to support your claims? Trevino's eyes flickered with frustration. Or it could be because the department protects its own. Another murmur swept through the crowd. Marshall exhaled sharply. No further questions. Judge Whitfield sighed. Sergeant Trevino, you may step down. As he walked past Ridley and Thompson, neither officer looked at him. The judge turned back to Gregory. Defense, your next witness? Gregory gave a knowing glance toward Elise. She nodded. The defense calls Miss Elise Morgan to the stand. Elise rose from her seat, adjusting her suit jacket as she made her way to the witness stand. She moved with the ease of someone who had done this before, stood before scrutiny, endured the weight of skeptical eyes. She raised her right hand, taking the oath. Then she sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Gregory approached. His voice was soft but carried through the room like a slow-moving storm. Miss Morgan, please state your full name and occupation for the court. Elise took a breath. Then, with deliberate calm, she spoke. My name is Elise Morgan. I am the director of the Department of Homeland Security. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. A camera flash went off somewhere in the back. Ridley's head snapped toward her, his mouth slightly open. Thompson paled. Marshall's expression hardened, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. The jury looked stunned. Gregory let the revelation settle before continuing. Miss Morgan, at the time of your arrest, did you inform the officers of your identity? No, Elise said smoothly. I wanted to see how they would handle the situation without knowing who I was. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Gregory nodded. And why is that? Elise turned toward the jury, her voice unwavering. Because this wasn't about me. She let the words sink in. This was about the abuse of power, about the assumption that certain people can be mistreated simply because of who they are. I wanted to see if the justice system these officers claimed to uphold would still function when the person on trial wasn't powerless. The jury listened, enraptured. Gregory continued. Miss Morgan, were you obstructing an investigation? No, she said firmly. I simply asked why they were there. That was all it took for them to escalate the situation. Gregory turned toward the jury. Miss Morgan, a woman tasked with protecting an entire nation, was deemed a threat for simply asking a question. A reporter scribbled furiously in the gallery. Gregory turned back to Elise. What happened after you were arrested? They laughed. Elise said simply. They joked about how I should have known better than to run my mouth. They call me one of those people. More murmurs. Gregory took a deep breath. And Miss Morgan, do you believe that if you were someone else, someone with less authority, less visibility, this case would have gone any differently? Elise's gaze swept across the jury. No, she said, because I wasn't the first person they've done this to. I was just the first person they couldn't get away with doing it to. Silence. Gregory turned back toward the judge. No further questions. Judge Whitfield turned to Marshall. Cross-examination. Marshall hesitated. Then, regaining her composure, she stood. She approached Elise with slow, measured steps. Miss Morgan, she said, her voice cool. Your position is one of great power, is it not? Elise inclined her head. It is. Marshall nodded. So you can understand why officers Ridley and Thompson might have been intimidated when dealing with someone of your stature. Elisa's lips curled into the faintest smile. Except they didn't know who I was, Ms. Marshall. Marshall's face darkened. Elise leaned forward slightly. So tell me, what exactly are they afraid of? Silence. Marshall straightened. No further questions. She walked back to the prosecution's table, her expression unreadable. Judge Whitfield exhaled, glancing between both parties. We will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements. She banged her gavel. Court adjourned. The room exploded into chaos. Journalists rushed toward the exit, eager to break the story. Spectators whispered animatedly. Ridley and Thompson remained frozen in their seats, as if reality had finally caught up with them. Elise stood, buttoning her jacket. Gregory turned toward her. You just turned this trial into something much bigger than a courtroom case, he murmured. Elise smiled faintly. Good. As she stepped toward the exit, Ridley called after her, his voice hoarse. You set us up. She turned back, meeting his panicked gaze. No, Officer Ridley, she said. You did this to yourself. She walked away. Outside the courthouse, the storm was only beginning. The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of the trial still lingered in the air. Eleanor Cross sat alone on the courthouse steps, her hazel eyes scanning the chaos that had erupted outside. Reporters swarmed like hungry vultures, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, all desperate to capture the moment the 17-year-old legal prodigy dismantled the prosecution. She had won, but the victory felt hollow. Samuel Brooks had been arrested. Agent Leonard West had been taken into custody. The corruption they had tried so hard to bury was now spilling into the light. And yet, Eleanor knew better than to believe it was over. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that the real power players never revealed themselves in the first act. And sure enough, her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. Miss Cross, a voice purred from the other end. It was male, deep, smooth, too smooth. You're an impressive young woman. Eleanor didn't respond. The voice chuckled. Ah, I see. You don't trust unknown callers. Smart. She exhaled. I don't have time for games. Oh, but Miss Cross, the man murmured, this is a game. And you just made your first real move. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. And you are. The voice remained calm. Consider me an interested party. Silence stretched between them. Then the man spoke again, lower this time. You have no idea who you just went to war with. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the phone. She had an idea. Brooks and West were just the face of the corruption. But the system itself? That was something bigger. I'm listening, she said finally. The voice hummed in amusement. Good girl. I'd like to meet. In person. There's something you need to see. Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct screamed trap. But then the man said something that changed everything. It's about your parents. Her blood turned to ice. She stood, her heart pounding. You're lying. A pause. Then, with quiet certainty. No, Eleanor. I'm not. 3 hours later, Eleanor found herself in a sleek, black-town car with tinted windows, speeding toward an unknown location. She had left a backup plan. If anything happened to her, a trusted contact would expose everything she knew. Still, she felt the weight of uncertainty settle over her as the car pulled into an underground parking garage beneath an unmarked building. The door opened. A man in a tailored suit stood waiting. He looked to be in his 40s, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. Miss Cross, he greeted, his voice unmistakably the same one from the phone. Welcome. Eleanor stepped out, scanning the surroundings. No security detail, no obvious threats. Still, she didn't trust it. Start talking, she said flatly. The man gestured toward an elevator. Everything you need to know is upstairs. Eleanor debated for exactly 3 seconds before stepping inside. The elevator door slid open into a high-tech office space, all glass and steel, lined with rows of files and computer monitors displaying classified government data. Eleanor's skin prickled. What is this place? The man adjusted his cuffs. Let's call it a private records archive. She turned toward him. Who do you work for? The man gave a knowing smile. Not important. He walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick manila folder. This, he said, is everything they buried about your parents. Eleanor's breath caught. Her parents had been attorneys, brilliant ones. They had specialized in exposing corporate fraud and government misconduct. Until one day, 8 years ago, they had died in what was ruled a tragic accident. But Eleanor had never believed it was an accident. She stepped forward, hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages. And then, her stomach dropped, because there, buried in the official records, was a connection she never expected. Samuel Brooks, Leonard West. Both had been involved in the last case her parents had worked on before their deaths. Eleanor's vision blurred with rage. They killed them, she whispered. The man beside her nodded. Or at the very least, they covered it up. Eleanor clenched her fists. The case she had just won? It wasn't random. Someone had orchestrated everything to draw her into this fight. And now she had to decide what to do with the truth. The man watched her carefully. You have 2 choices, Miss Cross. Eleanor slowly looked up, her hazel eyes burning. I can take this to the press, she said, her voice steady. The man chuckled. and it'll disappear before morning. You've seen what they're capable of." Eleanor knew he was right. "What's the second option?" she asked. The man's expression turned serious. "You play the long game." Silence stretched between them. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You dismantle the system from the inside." Eleanor inhaled sharply. "That's impossible." The man smirked. "Is it?" He gestured to the room. "We have resources, access, influence, but we need someone who can expose them without being detected." Eleanor's pulse hammered. This was bigger than she had imagined. They didn't just want her to uncover the truth. They wanted her to rewrite the game itself. Eleanor turned to the files once more, her mind racing. For years, she had fought battles in the courtroom, playing by their rules. But what if she stopped playing fair? She turned back to the man and smiled. "Tell me everything." Eleanor Cross had spent her life thinking the courtroom was the ultimate battlefield, that the law was the greatest weapon. But as she stood in the sleek, high-tech office filled with classified files, she realized something chilling. The real game wasn't fought in a courtroom. It was fought in the shadows. The man in the tailored suit leaned against the desk, watching Eleanor carefully. "You understand the weight of this decision, don't you?" he asked. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "If I do this, there's no turning back." He nodded. "That's correct." She looked back at the manila folder filled with the truth about her parents' deaths, about the corruption that ran deeper than she ever imagined, about who had pulled the strings. And then she saw it. A name, buried at the bottom of a redacted document. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just Brooks. It wasn't just West. It was Judge Bernard Holloway, the man who had presided over her trial. The man who had acted neutral, but had resisted the truth at every turn. Her entire case had been a setup, and she had walked straight into it. 2 days later, Eleanor was back in the courthouse. Only this time, she wasn't a defendant. She was the executioner. The press had been fed a carefully timed leak about an internal investigation into corruption within the legal system. And the courthouse was swarming with FBI agents, looking for one man in particular. Judge Holloway. He hadn't seen it coming. As he entered the courtroom that morning, his usual air of authority in place, he had no idea that today his own gavel would be his undoing, until the doors slammed open. Eleanor turned in her seat as agents poured in. Judge Bernard Holloway, the lead agent, announced, his badge gleaming. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering." The entire room erupted. Holloway froze, his usually cold face flickering with real fear. "This is absurd," he growled. "You can't." "You thought you could control the system," Eleanor said, standing slowly. "But you forgot one thing." Holloway's glare snapped to her. She smiled. "The system fights back." And just like that, the gavel fell on him instead. With Judge Holloway, Brooks, and West all exposed, a chain reaction swept through the legal system. High-ranking officials were implicated. Cases were reopened. The justice system itself was forced into reform. Eleanor had rewritten the rules, and she wasn't done yet. A week later, she met the man in the suit again. This time, she wasn't hesitant. This time, she knew exactly what she wanted. He smirked. "You made history, Miss Cross." She leaned forward. "And now, I'm going to change it." His expression flickered with interest. "Ow!" Eleanor's hazel eyes gleamed. "By becoming the thing they fear most." She extended her hand, and he shook it, a silent agreement. The game had changed, and Eleanor Cross was no longer a pawn. She was the player.